it doesn't seem to be likely that we're going to have a prospect of an independent Syrian government. And so what you're going to have is a post-Assad Syria, which is pro the US. Well, it's taken 13 years longer than they expected, but the Americans and the Israelis finally got what they want in Syria, which is regime change. Bashar al-Assad has been toppled. He has since fled to Moscow, where the Russians have granted him asylum. So who is happy and who isn't about what is happening in Syria? Well, the first winners of this appear to be the US. The US, the CIA, has long backed the rebels in trying to oust and topple Assad, who they claim to be in terms of the Arab Spring and the ousting of the dictators that have taken place since 2011, mostly by Western intervention. Also, when we look at what happened with Saddam Hussein in Iraq and what happened with Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya, both states meanwhile have descended completely into chaos, and in the case of Libya, into civil war which spanned years. But they said that Assad remained the domino which would not be toppled because of how much he clung on to power. So what may have started as a democratic uprising in 2011, soon enough the Syrian people realized that the cost of democracy was just too high and they weren't willing to pay it. Meanwhile, you had these rebels come in backed by the US and also backed by Turkey. Turkey had long disagreed with Damascus over their treatment of Kurdish rebels, and so backed these rebels, and especially seems to be very heavily involved in the unexpected success of the current onslaught. Meanwhile, the last winner in all of this is Israel. Israel has occupied the Golan Heights, which was territory taken by Syria in the 1967 war. In 1974, there was an agreed-to buffer zone in the Golan Heights between the two states for their own security, so that there was some space between them. Israel has already launched incursions into that territory in an attempt to take it over, claiming that it is doing so for its own security. We've heard that before. Meanwhile, who is the loser in all of this? Russia, in particular, has lost out because it has long backed the Syrian dictator. It has helped with airstrikes and with ground troops in terms of planning and in terms of helping the Syrian army fight against the rebels. It also has a military base and a naval base and an air base in Syria. And in an attempt to gain influence and control over the Middle East through its port of entry would have been Syria, that influence and control is no longer really tenable. It has lost its in. Meanwhile, also Iran has lost massively in terms of its axis of resistance that has formed the Shia Crescent, whereby it can transfer troops and transfer ammunition all the way through to its proxy Hezbollah. Hezbollah as a proxy also, along with the Syrians, along with the Russians, really tried to help Bashar al-Assad stay in power against the rebels. Hezbollah became incredibly strong while fighting in the Syrian civil war. But because Bashar al-Assad could no longer rely on both of them were too busy in other wars, Hezbollah was severely decapitated. It was severely diminished after its war with Israel recently. Meanwhile, the Russians are heavily involved in Ukraine. While they tried to help in the last few days by conducting airstrikes against the rebels, it was too little, too late, and the rebels enjoy now a stronghold and control over the territory. The question is really now, what will happen going forward? And we keep on seeing now on BBC News as well, on the front page, you see pictures of Syrians celebrating, pictures of Syrians saying that we can now finally breathe again because the dictator has been toppled. Again, it is important that anyone in this part of the world especially will always take that with the salt lake, essentially, because the push of liberal democracy, there's the new crusade, that of liberal democracy and human rights, and we've seen how much that has led to military intervention. And this is by a state, the US, which is run by a dictatorship of corporations and which enjoys the illusion of choice, as we've just seen through its last democratic elections. And meanwhile, promotes human rights while it is also co-authoring a genocide in Gaza. And even the controversy about human rights in this case, when we're talking about Bashar al-Assad, we're talking about someone who the West has long proclaimed used chemical weapons against his own people. Seymour Hersh in 2014, writing for the London Review Books, a seasoned journalist, said, "This is not correct. The US, under the Obama administration, cherry-picked intelligence. They did not tell us the full story, which was that the rebels also had chemical weapons. And it may be that they were the ones who used chemical weapons." This later led to Trump using airstrikes against Syria, for crossing the red line, which we were told was the chemical weapons attack. That has now, while Seymour Hersh was widely condemned at the time, was, defamed as not being a serious journalist for his support of Bashar al-Assad, that idea has now gained traction. We have more evidence supporting that notion that perhaps he did not use chemical weapons against his own people. And so really, again, the liberal democracy and human rights claim are something that I think, given what's happening in Gaza, we just will not give any leverage to. But what happens from here? What is the future of Syria? And it does seem that in terms of preserving their sovereignty and territorial integrity, it doesn't seem to be likely that we're going to have a prospect of an independent Syrian government. And so what you're going to have is a post-Assad Syria, which is pro the US. And so for anyone who is worried about US and Western intervention in the Middle East and no ability to counter that hegemony, this is very worrying for Syria, it's very worrying for Iran, and it's very worrying for anyone who is against US Western hegemony.